Professor Neville, thank you very much for this kind introduction. And this trick with the poster that I want to have put up, I really forgot it. It's not a trick that we are playing here. And good evening, it's great to be here. And it's really always fun for me and a great pleasure to come out to universities, to colleges and talk on Germany, talk on TTIP. But with the spirit of this season also to, of course, talk about the fall of the wall. I'll have basically 3 points in my presentation this evening. The first is Germany's central role in Europe, and I like to use the headline, Germany, Responsibility and Challenges in the Heart of Europe. A second point, something that we didn't know and think about when we planned all this, is the current crisis in Eastern Europe. I want to say a few words on that. Then I want to go and focus on transatlantic relations and TTIP, which is really one of the most important agendas that we have right now. But let me start out, first of all, to look back for 25 years. 25 years ago, November 9, 1989, the wall in Berlin opened. It was a great evening, and if that poster comes in, it's a great shot, young people standing on the top of that wall right in front of the Brandenburg Gate and celebrating that event. And for most of you, actually, you weren't born when that happened. But for me, much older, I joined the Foreign Service in 1983. The Cold War was still going on. We had NATO in the West. We had the Soviet troops in East Germany, 500,000 of them. And the Brandenburg Gate was kind of fenced in on either side with barbed wire and with that infamous wall right in front. And so when that wall came down and East Berliners and then East Germans were able to cross that wall, it was really, for people of my generation, a very, very momentous thing. And in fact, that now we have crises that are very different in different parts of the world, like the Middle East now or in Ukraine. In those days of the Cold War, that would not have been possible. Crises basically happened in Central Europe, and the two anchoring powers of the two blocs, the US and the Soviet Union, would try and see that those kind of crises wouldn't get out of hand, because we had so many nuclear weapons stationed on either side of the German border, the inner German border, that this would have meant total annihilation. And so for me, when I then later on served in Berlin and bicycling to work, crossed the Brandenburg Gate on my bike every morning, it really means something to me, being able to just go through that thing that in the old days we could just visit or see from afar. It's really a great, great moment. And as I said, for a lot of you, this is difficult to imagine. But I recall the images of 1961 when the wall came up. And masons from East Germany had to kind of really build a wall and fence themselves in so that they couldn't get out anymore. And troops would be there with ready weapons and an order to shoot on sight without even calling out to those people. Now it's very different, and we are happy that it happened, and we all know in Germany and in Europe that this would not have happened without the NATO alliance and the steadfast commitment of the United States of America to the freedom of Europe. And we are really grateful for that. With that, let me get into my presentation and start out with that idea of Germany's central role in Europe and the responsibilities that come out of that. Napoleon once said famously that a country's diplomacy is shaped by that country's geography. And if you look at a map of Europe, you see that Germany is right in the middle, geographically, right in the middle between Madrid and Moscow, and between the North Cape and Sicily. Germany is also the largest country demographically in Europe, 80 million people. and it has the strongest economy. And when Germany in the 19th century united and emerged as that large central power in Europe, it really upset the balance of power in Europe. And it became very obvious quickly that Germany at that time was then just too big to be a big Holland or Switzerland. On the other hand, as we have learned through 2 world wars, Germany was not big enough to dominate Europe. And this is basically where we get during the Cold War. Europe was divided, the 2 blocs came up, and the West created those 2 institutions that would then later on enable Germany to reunite. That was NATO, the strategic umbrella guaranteed by America, and the European Union. And this European Union was really a very, very central element as well during German unification. The wall came down on November 9, 1989. About 4 weeks later, in early December of 1989, Chancellor Kohl of Germany spoke to Secretary of State Jim Baker. And we have now the records of those conversations that took part. It's a very, very interesting reading. And Chancellor Kohl laid out his vision of how to unite Germany and also Europe. And he said to Secretary of State Baker, I will only get German unification if we also continue the integration of Europe. It was very clear and he said right away that that was the only way to go. And this is then how it happened. And Germany in 1990 was able to reunite with the consent of all of its neighbors in Europe. And if you think back in history, that is a very different kind of unification from that was done under Bismarck in the 19th century, when he famously used blood and steel, as he said, to unite Germany. Now, what did Chancellor Kohl mean when he spoke about further deepening and integration of Europe? Basically 2 things. Enlargement to those countries that became free in Eastern Europe. And secondly, introduction of the euro. And this is basically what President Mitterrand of France and Chancellor Kohl set out to do in 1990. And if we look back over the last 25 years, this is really what has happened in Europe. We have done the enlargement to Eastern Europe, and the euro is up and running. As you all know, we have some challenges in the Eurozone at the moment. And Germany had and is playing a central role in overcoming the difficulties that the Eurozone currently has. I will not bother you with all these acronyms like the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism, or the Banking Union. But what I want to say is that basically what is happening is that little by little, the richer countries of the Eurozone have taken over responsibility for guaranteeing the creditworthiness of the other member states of the Eurozone. That is not easy, because the treaties that underlie the Eurozone said that no country has to bail out other countries with their debt. So it cannot be done directly. There are indirect means of doing so. But to just give you an idea of the amount of money and of the responsibility that we are shouldering in that context, for the European Stability Mechanism, Germany has pledged 250 billion euros, a little less. And if you compare that to a country the size of the US that is about 4 times larger than Germany, it's like the US underwriting $1 trillion guarantee for its neighbors. It's just the huge amount of money that is out there. And the reason that we are doing this really goes back to that vision that Chancellor Kohl outlined in December of 1989 to Secretary of State Jim Baker. If we don't have, as as that central power in Europe, that kind of a European integration where we have means of discussing our differences, then it would be very difficult for Germany to take its course all alone. So we have a very deep commitment to preserving the Eurozone. And as Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, said, by preserving the Eurozone, we will also keep the European Union going. So it's a very deep commitment that we have. It's a large responsibility that we are shouldering, but I think we can do it. But there are also limits to what we can do and what we can guarantee. There are basically economic limits to that. Germany is only able and in a position to take those economic guarantees for our neighbors at the moment because we undertook very far-reaching reforms about 10 years ago. If you look at the title page of The Economist magazine in early 2003, they had a piece out that was called Germany, the Sick Man of Europe. We had very low growth at that time. We had a bubble, an economic bubble after unification that had burst, and we took some time to overcome that situation. And so basically those reforms, those steps that Germany took about 10 years ago, it's something like cuts to the social security system, it's increasing the pension age and making labor laws more flexible. You would probably call this in the US cuts to entitlement or something like that. It was not easy. The chancellor who started this reform process, which he called Agenda 2010, Chancellor Schröder, lost his re-election 2 years later. So politically you can see how difficult something like this is. But since the Germans had to go through this process, politically there is a limit to what the German people will accept in helping other member states of the European Union, especially if we feel that the other member nations are not willing to take the same kind of difficult reforms that we had to go through. Right now in Europe, we're looking forward. We have a new commission that is just about to enter into its office. And even though we have not totally overcome the difficulties in the Eurozone, my prediction is that President Juncker of the European Commission will be able to rebalance the powers in Europe. The Commission and the European Parliament will reassert themselves, will have a stronger position, and the heads of government of the member states in the Council will not play as important a role in the future as they have played during the financial crisis. Secondly, the European Union will go through reforms and will oversee economic reforms in France and Italy especially. On the other hand, we will have an agenda for growth, and there's talk about a huge fund that will be financed by all member nations to do so. And this kind of a mix, the balance between reforms in some important member states, but on the other hand also having a growth agenda, will enable Germany and Chancellor Merkel to accept this kind of a process forward. And I also hope that it will enable our friends in the UK to stay in Europe, and they will likely vote on membership in the EU in a couple of years. So that's on the European Union. My point really is Germany has a very central role in that European integration, and our commitment to continue doing so is very, very strong. Let me come to a second point, and that is the Ukraine crisis, because at the moment, when you think about transatlantic relations, you can really not look at this situation. You know, 25 years ago, we were so surprised by the fall of the wall and the end of those two blocks that some professors got carried away and wrote a book somebody wrote a book saying that it was the end of history, that no liberal democracy would rule ever after. And the world is not so. as we have seen. The former Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, who was a very important advisor to President Bush during the time when the wall came down, wrote a book. And she said, "Germany united, Europe transformed." As we are seeing now, that past participle that she is using, that she used at the time, is not correct. That transformation process in Eastern Europe is still ongoing. And if you look at some of the statements that are coming out of Moscow after Russia annexed Crimea, we see that they are, at least verbally, that there are intentions in Russia to threaten most of their neighbors. When President Putin speaks about the obligation of his Russia to help Russian minorities in his neighboring countries, he is really challenging most of his neighbors to the south and to the west, starting from the Baltic republics in the north all the way to Moldova in the south, and Ukraine, of course, right centrally. The important thing is, considering transatlantic relations without going into too many details, is that NATO stood firmly together during this crisis. We have introduced those sanctions that we needed to do in a coordinated fashion. And we believe that those sanctions that we have introduced have contributed to some of the compromises that President Putin was willing to make when he spoke to President Poroshenko a couple of weeks ago at Minsk. There's a ceasefire at the moment. It's a creaky ceasefire. There's shooting going on. But we do hope that the negotiation process will go forward. We have the middle of September right now. As we are seeing right now today, it's getting colder. Ukraine depends for its heating on Russian gas. A lot of other states in Western Europe depend on Russian gas. So to negotiate these kind of things in a global settlement that would also have to include minority rights for the Russians in eastern Ukraine is something that is ongoing. I believe we can do it. And Chancellor Merkel has very clearly said to all the participants that at this moment there is no military solution to such a crisis. I think she is in a very, very central position right now to make such a statement. She's the only one at the moment who is talking to both President Obama and to President Putin. And again, I think in this crisis we see that central role that Germany is playing right now in Europe. And it's an important commitment again that we are taking and speaking to either side. Let me come to transatlantic relations directly and TTIP. TTIP stands for Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. It's a negotiation process that was started a couple of years ago between the EU and the United States. Actually, the kick-off to that negotiating round came at the G7 summit near Rostock in Germany in 2007, when we organized a high-level group of business leaders who looked at various issues that are still blocking or that are still hindering transatlantic trade. Now, what are these issues that we still need to talk about? We have had trade negotiating rounds for the last 50 years. We started in the 60s with the Kennedy round. And yes, indeed, looking at tariffs, on average, tariffs between the EU and the US are very low, extremely low. But there are some peaks that are left over from past negotiating rounds. One of those peak tariffs, for example, is a levy on SUVs that are coming across the Atlantic. It's a remnant from one of the old compromises that we did even, I think, back in the 70s or early 80s. And the EU didn't like some of the chicken exports from the US, and we put a tariff up, and then you put a tariff up. This is the way these things go. But let us look at an issue like tariffs on SUVs, just as an example of what other problems are still out there. You all know that BMW has put a large plant into South Carolina, that Volkswagen has gone to Chattanooga, and that Mercedes is building its M-Class and GDL class in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. But when Audi recently looked to build a new plant in North America, they in the end went to Mexico. Of course, for a number of reasons. I mean, there's never one single reason that drives such a decision. But one of those reasons was that Mexico has both a trade agreement with the US, NAFTA, and there is an EU-Mexico trade agreement. And under both trade agreements, there is no tariff on SUVs. So Audi is able, from that new plant in Mexico, to go both to the US market and to the European market. So a plant in Mexico makes Audi more flexible than a plant in Tennessee would have made Audi. Again, there were other reasons why they went there. Volkswagen has a huge operation down there, so a lot of the other difficulties that are involved in setting up in Mexico were not a problem for them. But yes, tariffs were one of the reasons for that. And actually, when I first went to Alabama, a state that had tried to get that plant, they mentioned that problem to me right away and said, look, we have to do something about that. So tariffs is one thing, and we are committed to doing away with them. And tariffs is actually an easy thing to do in trade negotiations. You can normally put a price tag on a tariff, and then you can kind of either split the difference or kind of compensate the other side, and you do that. But tariffs are only a very small part of those trade problems that we still have. A much wider part in a modern trade negotiation is what we call standards and regulations. Now, what does that mean? If you go over here to the Research Triangle Park near Raleigh, you will have two very large German companies doing research there on crop science, BASF and Bayer. Now, when you try and develop a new pesticide, you have to get that pesticide registered. And currently, companies doing research on a new pesticide have to go through two different authorization processes on either side of the Atlantic. For a company like BASF, this means having two sets of lawyers telling the engineers what to document. And it's really doubling the cost of the regulatory process for those companies. The same goes for medicine. The same goes for plants that have been genetically modified. You know, people are looking for corn varieties that would use less water for growth. A very important crop for, the southwestern US or for the Sahel of Africa. Again, those plants would have to go to two different regulatory processes. Those kind of issues are also relevant for other industries. And the companies that are operating in all the world markets tell us that it is these difficulties that are much more important, that are much more cumbersome for them than a mere tariff is. So TTIP tries to do is either harmonize those standards. That is, of course, the best way of doing it. But standardization is difficult. It would really mean that Congress on the one side and the European Parliament on the other side and all the 28 national parliaments would have to agree to do away with their old standard and to do something new. Not easy to do, considering that in the medical industry, in the crop science industry, there are a lot of stakeholders at play. Citizens are worried about new crops. Citizens are worried about new pesticides. There are consumer protection groups that have a stake in the current standards that they have. So if we can do it, great, let's do it. But another option during the trade negotiation would be to mutually recognize the other guy's standard. And it's sort of what we have done in the European Union over the last couple of decades. And there is a very important court case out from 1979. It's called Cassis de Dijon. And the ruling of the European Court of Justice basically said, if it's safe for the French to drink a certain liquor, it must be safe for the Germans to drink that kind of liquor. And of course, the reason behind that court case was that a German producer was trying to forbid that French alcohol to come over, because German fruit liquors have 18% alcohol, the French only had 16%, and the German producer was trying to say, look, this is cheating, and so on. And again, the court basically did away with that. Very often, regulations or standards can be just a non-tariff barrier to trade. And so this idea behind the Cassis de Dijon decision, if this would operate also in transatlantic trade, it would really enable companies on either side to produce and plan for a much wider market, to have a product that would at the same time be developed for the 500 European consumers and 320 American consumers. And there's even more behind that. Both Europe and the US are democratic nations, and to a wide extent, we share the same democratic values, social values, and so on. Now, if we can now agree to mutually recognize our standards, we will really be driving the world market with our standards and our ideas and behind that. The way things are operating, I'm not trying to scare anybody, but the way current trends are operating in the world economy is that in a couple of decades, we will have other players on the world market that don't share our democratic and social values. China, for one, or some other of the emerging economies. And so if we can get together as democratic nations right now and agree on a common set of standards, or at least to mutually recognize our standards, I think that would be a very, very important signal for world trade. Let's say for the social standards behind trade, what kind of labor issues would have to be recognized before we accept a good to be imported? Or for example, what kind of environmental standards would have to be recognized before we accept a good product to be imported to our market? So those are some of the issues out there. It's difficult to really put a number on the potential benefits. Now, I'm an attorney by trade, and I always was kind of suspicious when the economic forecasters came and said, look, this is going to have an 800 million benefit on the one side of the market, on 400 million on the other side, and it's going to create so and so many new jobs on either side. We do believe that there will be an increase of trade, and history has told us that an increase in trade will also mean an increase in investment on either side, and therefore also new jobs being created on either side. So overall, we do believe that there will be a benefit if we can reach this kind of a trade agreement, and I hope that we can move forward. At the moment, the process is a little bit at an impasse. One of the reasons for that is that the US government, our negotiating partner, at this moment does not have the trade promotion authority or fast track authority that the US government needs to strike a deal with another country. At the moment, if the US government were to strike now a deal with either Europe or the Asians where you are also negotiating, Congress could pick apart every single line of that deal. And none of your negotiating partners would be willing to make a deal with the US if we know that Congress can really take it apart again. So the US Senate will have to vote on trade promotion authority. And we in Europe will also have to do our homework. If you look at the German press at the moment and some of the German public debates that are ongoing at the moment, you see a lot of scaremongering when the word TTIP comes up. And let me give you an example. My aunt is a retired teacher. She is now doing the church library for her church in Bielefeld. And when I was over in Germany last Easter, she really sincerely said to me that TTIP is kind of a conspiracy of the large companies that are trying to do away with the way German culture is run. It's a conspiracy driven by Amazon and others that are trying to dismantle what we call die Buchpreisbindung. That is, that bookshops have a certain price at which they have to sell a book. It really protects the little guy out somewhere in your neighborhood and makes it a bit more difficult for these giants to come in and corner the whole market. And she sincerely believed, and she is not a leftist, that big companies are out to destroy and undermine European culture. Same thing in France, where they believe that their audiovisual industry would be undermined by Hollywood if the market were truly too open. So there are fears out there. But I do believe that we should be able to overcome that, and that we will be able to overcome that once we move forward on either side with the negotiation, and once we can show to the voters that there's a huge benefit in increasing trade across the Atlantic. But it's a challenge out there. And I don't really think that at least the German government, to my mind, has probably not realized how difficult this would be and how difficult something like a dispute settlement mechanism that operates independent from normal courts, how that would be seen. We in Germany have introduced such language in all the trade treaties that we have done with other countries for the last almost 100 years. And we have done that, of course, mostly with countries where the legal system is not as strong as it is in Germany or the US. So we actually don't believe that it is really necessary for this kind of a dispute settlement mechanism to exist across the Atlantic, because we have strong legal systems on either side. But in the end, we have to see how we can accept it in the end. But this difficulty exists, and I hope that we'll be able to overcome that once we move forward and people can see the benefits of it. Another example on how difficult standards can be. European companies, German companies are selling millions of cars in the US. And those cars, when they are sold in the US, have different headlights from the lights that are accepted in the EU. But nobody in America would really believe that the cars with the European headlights that are being used in Europe are less safe than the cars BMW or Mercedes sell over here, and vice versa. The Jeeps that are being sold in Germany have European standard headlights. And again, nobody really believes in Germany that Jeeps with the headlights that you use in the US are less safe. And Chancellor Merkel once said publicly that as long as these negotiators are not able to do away with such an easy technical problem, we probably can just split the difference and get some engineers together in a room. They could probably work it out in an hour. As long as we have not done that things like new pesticides, new medicines are much, much more difficult to do because people don't really know what to expect and there's a certain anxiety out there. So I'm not saying it's easy, but there are huge benefits in increased trade. And let me just give you a few numbers on the German presence right here in North Carolina. German companies over the last 10 years or so have invested about $3 billion in North Carolina, and they have created more than 26,000 jobs. The largest concentration of German companies is around Charlotte, as you know, about 200 companies. But just as important are the investments that German companies have made in the research triangle. And Governor Hunt once said to me in complaints that, why did Mercedes go to Alabama? Why didn't they come to us? And I really told him that 700 engineers at BASF at the Research Triangle get a higher salary than 2,000 production workers get in Tuscaloosa. Now, more than half of those engineers that BASF has are doctors in their science. So, I mean, these are really smart people. They get high wages, and that Research Triangle really is a driver for the economy of North Carolina. Germany is the fourth largest trading partner that you have for imports. Our position is a bit further down for your exports. But Europe as an aggregate, taking all 28 nations together, would probably follow very closely your largest trading partner, that is Canada. And of course, normally number 2 is Mexico, number 3 is China. But as an aggregate, Europe would be much stronger than China is. Again, also that goes the other way. The investment the US has just in a small nation like Belgium is higher than the whole investment the US has made in a big country like China. Just those few numbers show you how important transatlantic trade is, and we really should be moving forward with that. I want to close on a few words on some of the challenges that Germany is facing in getting away from these trade deals and so on. And let me mention 3 things. The first challenge that Germany has is demographic. Germany as a nation does not grow. We have about 82 million people living in Germany, and our nation is not growing. Most of the other European nations, in fact, are not growing. And actually the only Western nations that are still growing is France and Europe and the US right here, and Canada, I believe. So it's really a challenge, because the way the social security net in Germany is financed, it depends on the next generation going to work and making its contributions to that net so that the retiring generation can benefit from it. So if the pool of younger workers gets smaller, we will really have to rethink how we finance that. It's a huge challenge out there. Second point I want to make on challenges, especially for a nation like Germany that does not have raw material to benefit from. Germany will only maintain its high living standard if we continue to be able to produce high-tech goods that we can sell at a premium in the world market. And this really means that we will have to continue developing these kind of products. We will have to be the first, for example, to accept or to take over new production processes, like we did when computers came up. The challenge then was how to integrate computers with a traditional machinery industry. Now we have done that. It works very well. But we have to continue investing and researching to keep that edge. Because the newly emerging nations are not sleeping. They are spending a lot of money on research and development as well. So it's a challenge out there for a country that does not have oil to pump up like the Russians have. We can't do that, so we have to do something else. A third challenge is out there for us in Germany. We have a very, very strong commitment on that, and that is the environment. We want to continue being a high-tech industrial nation, but emitting less CO2 at the same time. We have made great strides in getting towards that aim. I think at the moment we are producing about 25% of the electricity in Germany with renewable energy, mostly photovoltaic and wind, but some bioenergy as well. We want to increase the share of renewables in the production of electricity over the next decades. And as you all know, the sun doesn't shine all day, wind doesn't blow continuously. So how do you do these kind of things? And still produce electricity and energy at a price that will enable our industry to compete on the world market. I mean, we don't live alone on an island. We still have to be competitive. It's a huge challenge. I think it can be done. And we have made great progress, for example, when we started the program under the Erneuerbare Energiegesetz, the law on renewable energy, nobody believed that the share of photovoltaic energy being produced would increase so rapidly. It has in fact increased so rapidly that we have difficulties financing the subsidies that were promised at the time. But it shows you also, when you put a challenge out and you put a price tag on something, that engineers and entrepreneurs will go and come up with solutions that the bureaucrats and the parliamentarians who made those laws never even thought about. I mean, the price of photovoltaic energy and of wind energy has come down to a point where this kind of renewable energy now can compete with fossil energy in certain markets. And there are other challenges. I mean, the sun naturally shines most during lunch hours. A lot of the electricity producers are mostly being, let's say, done in the morning or in the afternoon. So how do you get those kind of things together? The production on the one side, the consumer on the other side. Again, I think solutions can be found. The internet is out there. You can network production and consumption. I'm sure that some of the young generation that is coming up, some of the young engineers will be able to come up with those kind of solutions. That entrepreneurs, once they have a framework that gives them a clear signal where to go, will find a solution to go forward. But it's a huge challenge, and as I said, we want to continue to be a rich nation, we want to continue being an industrial nation, so that's the gap that we will have to straddle. I will leave you with that, and I'll be happy to take questions if you have any. Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Can you comment on the spying scandal and the bugging of Angela Merkel's phone calls and how that's affecting German-American relations?
Yeah, I knew this was going to come, so I didn't really address it. This has made TTIP much more difficult. And that spying scandal, it continued. I mean, we just recently discovered a CIA spy in our own spy agency. And actually, we found him out when he was trying to sell the products that he had already sold to the CIA to the Russians also. And we had monitored the Russian consulate's email, but not the Americans. Anyway, for two countries that work so closely together, I think this spying scandal really shows something. It is when you let the specialists in that field run without sufficient political oversight. They will do things that are worse than a crime. They're just a mistake in an alliance that we have with NATO, within the transatlantic relationship. Angela Merkel, during the last decades, really has been the most pro-American leader that we have in Germany. And to alienate her in such a way, and that was really came out 2 weeks before the elections or 3 weeks, was a huge problem for her, and a problem that we don't need at a time when we have so many new challenges coming up. I mean, we are working together on the Ukraine crisis, and especially also we are right now working together on the Middle East problem with the terrorism. And we all know that the monitoring that is being done by our agencies jointly with the NATO enable us, for example, in many cases, to arrest a terrorist or a terrorist group before they can carry out their threat. Angela Merkel normally refers to a group that we caught about 3 years ago. It's called the Sauerlandgruppe. And the way we found them out actually was that a German agency employed by an American army installation to guard the perimeter found a suspicious car. They ran down the owner of that car, and then they shared that information with the Americans. And then the American side looked and found that that guy was having email conversation with Pakistan, with the tribal areas in Pakistan where the Taliban sit. And so that's when they went out and looked for that group and found them. what I'm trying to say is, in today's world, intelligence gathering is part of reality, and it's part of what we do, what we have to do to protect ourselves and our alliance. And so in that context, as a German minister said, to alienate the leader of a friendly nation was really an act of folly. And let me leave it at that. Yes, please.
In the face of such headwinds, such as the Ukraine crisis, the Russian sanctions, and basically the general plight of the single currency in Europe, do you truly believe that the ECB's stimulus package will have or prove to be effective?
I think it will be. I'm not an economist, but what it's doing at the moment, within the frameworks that we have, I mean, we have a framework where we have said you cannot directly finance another government. So that's a limit that at the moment the ECB cannot cross. So they have indirect ways. One way is driving down interest rates. Now, a creditor nation like Germany is losing money through that, whereas debtor nations like especially Italy, Greece, but also France are saving money. It's an indirect money transfer, if you want to see it that way. The important thing is then, for those countries that are benefiting from the ECB's policies, to use that leeway that they have under the current policy and still go forward and do those reforms. And the difficulty normally is political. Unless a leader in a democracy who has to face the electorate in a year or two really faces a threat where he just cannot go on anymore, normally they shy away from doing difficult reforms. And so the unfortunate thing is that some of those programs that we have done have enabled our partners in the European Union to continue going on steady as she goes and not really do hard reforms that might cost them politically. And so that's really the difficulty that we are operating under. And the difficulty, secondly, for the ECB is, I mean, we're not one nation. We don't have one ECB and one government. They make a phone call and they can move quickly as the US Federal Bank could. We are not there. Third point is, of course, the ECB acts under a framework where countries like Germany and Austria and Holland are very hesitant to accept policies that might be seen as inflationary. No German leader can go and say yes to a policy that prints money, to use layman's terms. And in such a context, this is where they have to operate. So what they're doing at the moment is the extent of what they can do. And I believe, and that's what I was trying to say, I believe that if we come to a point where it can be shown that we have both an agenda that has pro-growth spending, and if you look at the infrastructure in Germany and in Europe, we need some of that, but where we also have the possibility to show to the German voter that our neighbors are willing to do the same difficult cuts to their pension systems like we have gone through, then the political compromise will in the end be possible. Difficult answer to a simple question. The European Union is not a nation state and decision making is much more difficult. And this is the framework that Mr. Draghi is operating under. At the moment, we are doing okay. One sentence that he has said, that he will do whatever it takes, has bought us 2 years. Not all nations have done what was needed to do. Spain did, Ireland did, Portugal did. Greece has made great progress, but not all member states have yet gone that way.
Secondly, real quick, can you just talk about your time in Pakistan real quick? In 2005 it was?
Yeah, 2003 to 6.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, it was a challenging post in that we had NATO troops and German Bundeswehr troops next door in Afghanistan. So part of my job was negotiating a safe passage for the supply lines and all that. And at the same time giving our Pakistani partners the message, look, we have all committed to defeating the Taliban. You say so also, then please don't give them a safe haven after their attacks on our troops. And they would always say, well, we don't do that. And you know, it was a difficult process with that. Security-wise, I would say that we felt, and my wife would agree, we felt more safe in Pakistan than we did in Venezuela, where the crime was random. No, some young guy on drugs with a gun, no job, might attack you in broad daylight at a traffic light. In Pakistan, we normally believe that we would be able to look at the threat out there and make a decision, let's say in a security briefing, okay, you can go there on a Thursday, but not on a Friday afternoon after the prayers. Some things like that. Or we would estimate that Al-Qaeda would try and kill the president of that country, Musharraf, because in their view he had betrayed them. But we believe that that they would not attack German or French diplomats or people in Pakistan. Now, we look the same as most Americans, so in that sense, that was kind of a very insecure assessment. But we did make those kind of assessments. Based on those assessments, we would move and normally felt quite safe about it. But yeah, very challenging environment. Yes, please.
So, with Germany's focus on sustaining green energy, do you think that TTIP can be used for, by German companies or even by Germany itself to influence green energy production in America? Or is that a goal, or is that like, yeah, is that a goal of TTIP at all?
No, that is not a direct goal of TTIP. And we don't make decisions for Americans. But what we are trying to do actually, before that very important conference coming up in December of 2015 in Paris, is that we would try and find more allies for the EU's position, that we have to move forward more quickly. And we would really hope that the US at that time would be able to make a stronger commitment. I mean, at the moment you have a government that is willing to do so, but they stop at certain points where they believe Congress would never follow. And that is a problem. And I mean, we have seen that China has taken very, very important commitments. Now, and China is a country that is still growing, that has still a very large percent of its population that is very poor. That's a country that believes it needs to grow to enable all of its citizens to come out of poverty. But already China has made important commitments. India needs to follow. They haven't really done as much as they needed to. Brazil, I mean, those other big nations have to follow. Russia would have to follow. But we hope that we have more partners next time around. Yes, yes, indeed. Please.
Have the crises in Ukraine and in Iraq and Syria put a bigger strain on U.S.-German relations? I think that U.S. would like to show a strong face to Russia, but there's only so much that Angela Merkel can do when Germany still relies very heavily on Russia for gas and raw materials?
I don't think so. And let me tell you why. I mean, there was really a strain 10 years ago when we did not follow into Iraq. And I think looking back, more people in the US would agree that we had the right position at the time. As I said earlier, basically we discuss things in an alliance. And some countries like to move faster, especially the Baltic nations, that directly feel the threat of Russia because they have large Russian minorities. Poland, living right next to Belarus and the Russians, also would like to see faster steps. Now, some of our other partners further west in Spain or in Italy don't feel threatened by Russia at the moment. So the alliance has to come up, NATO has to come up with a joint answer. And if you look at what we have done, I think the sanctions that we have introduced are quite significant. I mean, in the beginning, if you recall those things, everybody was willing to say, okay, let's move there, but not on something that affects me. The Brits didn't want to do banking or finance. The agricultural nations didn't want to do agricultural sanctions, and we didn't want to do it on machinery products. No, we have now a very good cross-sample of all of these things. And I think that we have also been able to get pretty close to the people surrounding President Putin in Russia. And I think he's getting the message also. Yes, please.
With Germany's recent goals.
I didn't quite understand the outset, the beginning of your question.
Is how German companies are buying out American energy
Oh, okay,
companies
yeah.
going to affect?
I mean, larger German companies decide on their own business case. They move into new fields because they feel that's productive and profitable for them. Now, whether that is affecting, let's say, some other other fields, I don't think so. I mean, a large company like Siemens or like BASF or some of the other multinational groups that we have, they will look to the US market, to the US framework, and define a strategy for that market. And at the same time, if they believe that the EU moves faster on renewables, they will go for that market as well. And I certainly believe that some of the solutions that we have found and that we are finding in Europe, eventually we will be able to market them also in other areas of the world. So in our view, actually, we are investing at the moment, and down the line we'll get energy that is both clean, and once these investment costs have been paid off, also cheaper than some of the fossil energy that we are using. Or if you, let's say, look at those states that are still relying on nuclear power, especially on new nuclear power stations, the fixed costs that you have to put into those power stations are so tremendous, and the risks involved in heavily or densely populated countries are so huge that I don't really think that today you could get a business case for a new power station unless there's a political decision to do it. We are getting out of nuclear. If you ask me personally, a little bit too fast, but that's a different problem. But whether it's 10 years or 20 years, we are getting out of it. I personally would have used nuclear for some of the transition period. At the moment, we're getting cheap coal from the US because you are relying on fracking. Coal has become so cheap that German power stations will buy US coal. They pay the penalties for the CO2 emissions, and it's still cheaper than using the gas from Russia. It's the way the market works. It's just the wrong signal that they're getting. And we have to put some price on CO2, I believe. And that's especially the point where Congress will not get into. And that's one of the issues that is out there. If we had a price on CO2, we would get the market signals out there for scientists, for entrepreneurs to move forward worldwide.
Time for one more question.
Yes, please. Let's take two. No, why don't you have them jointly and I'll try and sum up.
Do you think Europe should create a joint military strike force opposed to a series of weak, fragmented militaries relying on the U.S. for protection?
Mine's completely different.
Good.
Your aunt and viewpoint on TTIP being a threat to German culture. Could you address the issue of immigration and Germans' viewpoint on immigration, which is also an issue for other European countries and obviously an issue for the United States, immigration and German culture?
Two difficult questions at the end. Wow. We have some smaller setups in Europe that actually we are using now in the present crisis with Russia. We are using that core that is jointly being formed by Poland, Germany, and Denmark, headquartered in Czechia and Poland. And we're using those troops to oversee the deployment of the circulating forces that we're using in the Baltic nations. So there are small steps that we are taking. But at the moment, I don't see really the commitment to fully integrate our militaries. There are different traditions, there are different histories with all the hang-ups that we still have. There's always a business case also in, let's say, buying the weapons for militaries. I don't think we'll get there in the foreseeable future. And so what we have to do is really try and make the best use of the cooperation that we have. We have some other joint forces like the German-French Brigade, for example, and so on. But you're right in your assessment that Europe at the moment would not be able to do a commitment as a European force like the French or the US is doing in Syria. Yes, we are not there yet. And especially Germany's armed forces were always organized in the Cold War for a very different mission. We don't have these kind of tanker aircraft that would enable our Air Force to go there. I mean, we had a short-range mission. We had a heavy tank force that you can never use in these interventionary forces, so Germany is really not there at the moment. And actually what I just read today that Parliament has asked the Bundeswehr to come up with a readiness assessment of all the weapons that we might be using in a context of a crisis like in Syria. And I think there will be some very difficult assessment that we have to do on how we move forward on our armed forces in that context. Going to be very expensive to address some of those issues. Immigration. I spoke earlier on the demographic crisis that we have, and immigration is part of the answer to that. The difficulty is that we in Germany have never seen ourselves as an immigrant nation. So we never had a policy like the Americans where you had certain type of visas for specialists and so on. We are getting there, but very slowly. Chancellor Schröder, about 10, 12 years ago, tried to do something like your green card. And it was election season, and the opposition party said, no, we don't want Indians, computer guys, right? No, we don't want Indians, we want more children. In Germany, that rhymes, Kinder statt Inder. I mean, these things are not easy, and you know that from the US. But seriously, immigration is part of the answer to the demographic problem. We have passed laws recently that enable students who graduate from a German university. They have 1 year to go find a job in Germany. If they find that job, they can stay in Germany. Something that was unthinkable about 5, 6 years ago. So we're getting there, but very slowly. And at the moment, the difficulties we are facing is really on a very different level. We have seen these boats coming over from Northern Africa every day, especially in the winter months. A lot of these boats capsize. There are dead people washed ashore daily in Italy and in Greece. And the difficulty will be, how do we have the solidarity within the EU? We cannot expect Italy and Greece to accept all of these refugees. Under the current rules, the country where they first get into the Schengen zone or into Europe, they have to accept them as asylum seekers. Now, with the current wave of boat people from Africa, I don't think this will be sustainable. The German Interior Minister has just called for new ideas to be discussed within the European Union. But it's a very sensitive issue, especially for those countries where there are elections coming up. But immigration in the end will be an answer to that demographic challenge that we have. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.